self-reports and friend reports for each of these items. And then we wanted to capture daily measures of emotional support, so a different type of helping behavior than what you saw before, and focusing really on a lot of exchanges that happen in dyads. So here they had the question, how did you respond when your friend told you about a positive event? And they had a very similar question for negative events. And the way they responded was answering these 3 questions. So I tried to make my friend feel understood, valued, and cared for, this is a measure that people often use in terms of thinking about responsiveness and empathy towards your friend. So for each of these, they reported how responsive they thought they were. And we also got the friend's perspective and asked, how responsive was your friend when you told them about these events? And for these sets of analyses, I'm going to focus on the within subject level of analyses. So I'm going to show you how I examined whether specific events and feelings co-occur with each other on a daily basis. So for example, I wanted to look at, on days when positive empathy goes up, does your prosocial behavior also increase? So if you look here at this graph of what I'm calling a high correspondence individual, you can see that over the 14 days, this is just kind of some actually this is real data. So you can actually see that this person's positive empathy was fluctuating in a pretty similar pattern to their helping behavior. In contrast to a low correspondence individual here, where it really seems to be fluctuating, but not together. So what I was trying to see is whether there would be an association more like a high correspondence individual across all the different individuals in the study. And so again here, I did a multi-level model in which I had the two different models, but here I'm focusing within subjects. And so the first thing I'll show you is looking at emotional support for friends after a positive event. And so here, negative empathy showed a positive relationship with predicting how supportive you are during a positive event. But as you might expect, positive empathy was more predictive of how supportive you are during a positive event. In addition, it predicted about 30% unique variance. So above and beyond negative empathy, it's predicting how supportive you are in these positive events, which is important to think about, because if people are typically measuring negative empathy, they're kind of missing out on all this additional variance you might be able to predict if you included positive empathy. But what was interesting when I looked at emotional support for a friend after a negative event, negative empathy did show a positive relationship above and beyond positive empathy, but positive empathy also showed a positive relationship, and pretty similar in terms of the strength, which was interesting, kind of lending itself to the possibility that you might be helping someone in a negative situation because you're anticipating that moment right after where you're sharing that moment. So this provided some initial evidence that positive empathy does seem to play an important role in prosocial behavior and might be predicting things that negative empathy is not predicting that well, or can really add additional variance. And this predicted about 11% additional variance. And so when I looked at friend reports, so this is now from the perspective of the friend, I showed very similar results. So when the friend said that someone had been high in positive empathy, it predicted that person also felt more supported by their friend. So again, positive empathy emerged as a stronger predictor, in fact predicting 50% of the variance above and beyond negative empathy for positive events, and found similar results here, again, where positive and negative empathy were similar strength in predicting during negative events. So this was nice to think about from both people's perspective. Positive empathy is making an impact on how supportive or supported they feel by their friend. So in thinking about this, we have 2 kind of initial pieces that suggest that we should think about positive empathy when we're thinking about helping behaviors, not to replace negative empathy, but potentially as an additional motivator of helping behavior. So we might really be sharing in the happiness of people after we've helped them. In addition, it showed that positive empathy was a better predictor than negative empathy, especially for support during positive events, but it also added a lot during negative events. So it seems to be an important predictor in terms of prosocial behavior. After realizing that it could be an important predictor in helping behavior, we also wanted to think about what's unique about positive empathy. And one unique thing is that when you're connecting with someone's positive emotion, it might boost your own mood. Whereas when you're connecting with someone's negative emotion, you might connect with their negative mood, right? So there might be different effects on your own well-being. So we wanted to see if positive empathy would more effectively buffer people from stress as well as loneliness, because positive empathy might be a unique opportunity to connect with people with no downside. So I'm going to show you results from the same study that I just talked about. So I'm just reminding you that these were 98 undergrads and we had dyads. But this time I'm showing you different outcomes. So we're focusing on stress and loneliness. So again, we use these one-item predictors. Here again, I also used the scales that had multiple items and found similar results, but I'm just showing you these. And in terms of the daily outcomes, every day for 14 days, people rated how lonely they felt. So this is based on the UCLA loneliness scale. I'm showing you 3 items, but it was a 6-item scale. And we also asked them to report how stressed. So answering items like, I felt that I was unable to control the important things in my life. So this is based on Sheldon Cohen's perceived stress scale, and we just modified it to be 4 items that they completed. And for the analyses I'm going to show you, I again averaged across all 14 days. So we wanted to see if people higher in positive empathy might generally feel less lonely and less stressed. So we just want to establish that initial association. So similar to the format I showed you before, what I'm going to look at is how positive empathy predicts average loneliness across the 14 days. And I found a strong negative relationship. It predicted 26% of the variance in loneliness. And when I looked at perceived stress, how positive empathy predicts perceived stress, again, I saw a negative relationship here when you look at the beta, but you can see it wasn't quite as strong, but it was again showing that it was predicting about 13% of the variance in the perceived stress. So after showing that positive empathy is having these effects on well-being, I wanted to see if positive empathy was doing something about negative empathy. So you're seeing that my analyses are very systematic here, but just to show you that when we looked at negative empathy as a predictor after controlling for positive empathy, it was not a significant predictor, but positive empathy was, and was showing a strong negative relationship. In fact, it predicted 21% of variance above and beyond negative empathy. Similarly, for perceived stress, we found that negative empathy was not a significant predictor above and beyond positive empathy, but positive empathy was negatively predicting perceived stress above and beyond negative empathy. And it was predicting about 13% of the additional variance. So I just want to mention here, again, I'm showing you averaged across the 14 days. I also looked within subject, again, to look at the fluctuations across time and found similar results, basically showing that positive empathy was predicting outcomes above and beyond negative empathy. I also, one thought you might have is that, oh, it's not positive empathy, it's just being a happier person or experiencing more positive emotion that might be explaining these relationships. So I also controlled for daily levels of happiness. So even when I control for how happy someone is, their positive empathy is predicting decreased loneliness and stress. I also looked at lagged analyses to try and get at a causal relationship. So if I'm feeling high positive empathy today, does that mean I will feel less lonely tomorrow? I looked at the reverse way. I didn't find an association, a lagged association, which doesn't mean there's not a causal direction, but that's to be determined. It's at least show that there is an association, and some of my future work is really going to tease apart the causal direction of this relationship. So after looking at it in a daily diary, I also wanted to take this into the scanner. So of those 98 students, I scanned half of them. So I randomly picked one member of the dyad and scanned 48 participants. And one of the goals of this study was to look at neural responses to your friend's positive outcomes. So I took the same friend that they had reported on in the daily diary and had both of them come in and participate in this task. And the idea was, could we look at people's neural responses as they're seeing their friend win money and see if that will predict being less stressed and lonely in their daily life. So can we essentially find a neural marker of positive empathy and see what it actually predicts in daily life? One of the goals of the task was people would play to win money themselves, so that would get at neural responses when you're having rewarding outcomes, but you would also observe your friend play. So the friend was in the same area, just in a different room, and we were told they were playing simultaneously. Of course, we deceived them and told them later. And the structure of the task was that it was a card guessing game. So they were told they would have a deck of cards, and the cards would be numbered 1 through 9. But this deck of cards in particular is missing card number 5. And the reason is because they're going to guess, is the card above 5 or below 5? So it's basically a 50-50 guessing game. And they made those guesses for themselves, but they also observed their friend play the same game. And they were told that they could win real money from the task. So undergrads actually were pretty excited about the task because they could win money and they were watching their friend win money. So just to take you through the task a little bit, people first saw a fixation cross. Then they saw their own photo as well as the symbol. The symbol just indicated that you're about to play a game in which you could potentially win $5. Then they saw a card in the middle with a question mark being like, what is this card? Is it above 5 or is it below 5? And they could indicate whether they were going to guess above or below 5. And when they selected their choice, a yellow box appeared around it. And then in $5, so they guessed it's above 5. It turns out it's an 8. They win $5. But if they're wrong, they would just get $0. So in this case, there's not a lot of downside, and they can potentially win $5. And while there are a lot of parts to this task, here's just some of the time. I'm focused today on the outcome. So the moment that you win $5 or you don't get any money, you just get $0. So to capture positive empathy, it's basically the exact same structure. The only difference is now instead of your own photo, you're seeing your friend's photo and your friend is playing. So you're observing your friend. The difference is that you're not playing, but we wanted to make sure people were still engaged in the task and not bored and not just zoning out. So when they saw their friend select the up arrow, they had to imitate it. So if they saw that the arrow was on the left side of the screen, they would press the left button just to show they were paying attention. Almost all participants basically were paying attention on all tasks. And this also matched the motor response, right? So you're having a motor response when you're playing. This matched it in terms of neural activity. And again, I'm focusing here on the outcomes the moment you see that your friend has won $5. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about positive empathy. So I wanted to capture the contrast in particular I look at is neural activity when your friend wins $5 compared to when your friend gets $0. And so what we saw across these 48 participants is activity in both the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So we finally got some activity in the ventral striatum, and one reason here might be that you're really close and connected with your friend. So you might be seeing rewards more like you experience rewards for yourself. This was also consistent with what we had seen before in terms of ventral medial prefrontal cortex. When you were winning money for yourself, I compared when you won $5 compared to when you got $0. And you can see here the activity is more robust because you're winning money for yourself, so it's typically stronger. So we got activity both in the ventral striatum and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So next what I wanted to do is do these regions. Are we activating the same regions, personal reward as positive empathy? So what I'm showing you here is a conjunction, which is showing where they overlap statistically. And so you can see here that it overlapped both in the ventral striatum as well as the medial and ventral medial prefrontal cortex. One of the other reasons I wanted to do this was because this really suggests these are regions that are activated during rewarding experiences. So can we average activity in these regions, similar to how you might calculate an individual difference measure? Can we look at average activity and use it as a marker of how much empathy you're experiencing or how rewarded you feel when your friend is winning money, and see if that predicts feeling less stressed and less lonely in daily life? So we're taking this very specific marker of when you're watching your friend win money and trying to see if it can predict a broader pattern of feeling less lonely and stressed in daily life. So what I'm going to show you is I took each region that had overlap, which are presumably regions associated with reward, and I averaged activity in this region and used it to predict the average level of loneliness and stress in people's daily life. So the more rewarded or the more reward-related activity you saw in the right ventral striatum, would that predict less loneliness? And so here we saw a negative association, which kind of parallels some of the behavioral results, but what here we're doing is using a neural marker instead. And I saw a similar pattern when you looked at the right ventral striatum predicting mean daily stress. So again, not quite strong with, this is a marginal correlation, but a similar pattern suggesting that a neural marker of positive empathy is associated with less loneliness and stress. I also looked at the left ventral striatum and found exact same pattern, so reduced loneliness as well as reduced stress. And what was interesting about this, that we were surprised about, is that these were the only regions that predicted less loneliness and stress in daily life. When we looked at these the reward activity when you were winning money yourself, that didn't predict your loneliness and stress. So it seemed like there was something unique about these shared positive experiences that's able to predict your loneliness and stress at a daily level. So that was really interesting, because you might think that how rewarded you feel yourself would be more associated. So I showed you both behavioral results and also neural results, but this really suggests that maybe there's something special about positive empathy that could be important for how connected we feel and also how stressed we're feeling in our daily lives. So now I want to move to some of my current directions, but first I'm just going to summarize what I've told you so far. So when we think about positive empathy, in the first section of my talk, I think it provides evidence that positive empathy is a distinct psychological process. So we saw that both looking at trait measures as well as state measures of positive empathy, that it seems to be distinct psychologically. But also in my experimental study, looking at the fMRI results, I showed that positive and negative empathy were activating unique areas that are associated emotions that the target is experiencing. And then I showed you meta-analysis data showing that at a broad level across 25 different studies, it's activating that same reward-related region. So together this suggests that positive empathy is a distinct construct and could potentially be added into models of empathy and psychological models. In the second section of my talk, I suggested that positive empathy might be an additional motivator of positive social behaviors. So I showed you results both, again, at the trait and the state level, looking at how these fluctuations in positive empathy were corresponding with increased pro-social behavior. So, and it really suggested that if we stay focused on negative empathy and predicting pro-social behavior, we're missing out on an important piece that might be predicting healthy behavior that we can't get from negative empathy. And in the third section of my talk, I showed you daily diary data, but I also showed you that neural markers of positive empathy are predicting reduced stress and loneliness in daily life. And above and beyond that, in the daily results, we saw that positive empathy is better at predicting reduced loneliness and stress than negative empathy. And in the neural data, we showed that it's better at predicting it than our personal experiences of reward. So again, I think this suggests there might be a unique role for positive empathy in our well-being. So in moving into my current and future directions, I'm just going to tell you how I'm extending this work and expanding on it. In a lot of the results I've talked to you about, and you might be thinking, well, these are just associations, there's no causal direction. So a lot of my future directions are teasing apart the causal direction. Now that I've established that positive empathy is distinct and also an important predictor, can we show causal associations? So in some of the work that I'm doing now, I'm looking at associations between positive empathy and measured clinical disorders such as mania and depression. So I found at the trait level that positive empathy is associated with increased risk of mania, and it's negatively associated with things like social anxiety and depression. And I'm also currently conducting an experimental study looking at how positive empathy might be disrupted in mania. So that will kind of tease apart what is the role of positive empathy in clinical disorders, and does it function differently in things like depression and mania. Another direction I'm going is looking at both interventions and manipulations of positive empathy to show that it then might boost prosocial behavior as well as decrease loneliness. And I'm also looking at changes in positive empathy across the lifespan. And in particular, I'm focusing on the lifespan because as you get older, you tend to focus more on positive emotions and less on negative emotions. And so I thought this might have some corresponding changes in positive empathy. So I've actually, that same neural task that you saw earlier, or the last task that I showed you, I also collected that in adults who are 65 years or older. And they also completed trait measures of positive empathy and loneliness and stress. So I'm going to see how positive empathy might change over the lifespan and give us insight into why it might be important as you age. And lastly, this is the area or the topic I'm most excited, so I'll dig into this a little bit. But I'm interested in how positive empathy might impact our social network structure as well as the spread of well-being. So I've just got a couple more minutes to tell you about this last direction. So in particular, I'm going to look at how interactions in our social network might actually affect biological measures of stress. So in this case, I'll be measuring cortisol during daily interactions. And some of the questions I want to answer by looking at a social network are whether individuals who are high in positive empathy, are they more likely to promote the spread of well-being across their whole social network? In addition, are they more likely to become more socially connected over time? So if we look at social networks evolving, do people kind of draw in towards people who are more empathic? In addition, can people who are high in positive empathy buffer other people by reducing their distress or connecting with their positive emotions during an acute stressor? So I'm going to give you a little more detail about the design so you can kind of wrap your head around what I'm currently doing. I'm currently collecting right now I'm collecting from one freshman dorm, but we'll be doing 2 freshman dorms, all at the same time. So these are all undergrads housed in the same dorm. And we're collecting data from the entire social network, or as much of it as we can recruit. And in addition, we're looking at friend dyads within that network, so we can get a more granular sense of how these dyadic interactions are playing out. And Stanford is a quarter system, so each quarter is 10 weeks. So in the first 3 weeks, this is what the study looks like. We map the social network, and we ask people to nominate who is empathic. So they have to nominate 8 friends who might be empathic. And what we can look at is across the whole social network, are there some people that are being identified consistently as being empathic? So the more nominations you have, that would be more likely that you're universally thought of as being an empathic person. And then we're also assessing trait positive and negative empathy at that time point. During week 2, which is considered a non-stressful time of the quarter because they don't have midterms or anything yet, we're measuring diurnal cortisol on 2 days. And on 14 of those days, we're also doing daily diary. So cortisol is only on the first 2 days, just because it's hard to get freshmen to do spit samples 4 times a day for more than 2 days. And so what we wanted to do here is really capture a low stress time when people are interacting with their social network and getting a baseline for what their stress levels might be. And then in week 10, which is the week before finals, we also wanted to measure the diurnal cortisol again for 2 days and do the daily diary for 7 days. So this is considered a high stress time. And one of the advantages of this design is we can compare how people are interacting when they're in low stress and who they're interacting with in their social network to a time of high stress. So let me just tell you a little bit about this first question about how we're trying to analyze the data. So will someone who's high in positive empathy promote the well-being of their entire network? We can look, for example, if you think about a social network and all of the different connections you might have with people, and for a moment pretend that these people in orange are high in trait empathy and have been nominated by a lot of their peers as being highly empathic. What we want to measure about all the members of the network is we have them report the 3 most important positive events and 3 most important negative events that they experienced that day. And then we ask them to tell us who did you tell about these positive and negative emotions. And by having the whole network do it, we can simultaneously know who they told, but also the positive and negative events that they heard that day. So you can kind of get a sense of how emotions might be exchanged in the social network. And then lastly, we have everybody at the end of the day report on their levels of stress and loneliness and happiness. And so for a moment, if we think about hearing other people's positive events, for a moment, think that imagine that this person is high in trait positive empathy. And we can think about them hearing positive events from people throughout their day. We might predict that since this person is more sensitive and more likely to share other people's positive emotions, they might show increased, there might be a larger cumulative impact. So if I'm more sensitive to these positive emotions, it might have a bigger impact on me. So it might predict this person at the end of the day might feel less stressed, less lonely, and happier than someone who's not as high in trait positive empathy. If you think about the other way, so how is this person high in trait positive empathy responding to other people's events? We can also map the other direction. So when we're thinking about them responding, they might be more effective at connecting with other people's positive emotions. So it might be a higher likelihood that they're boosting all the positive emotions of the people around them. So we might predict that the people around them might also be less stressed. And turning to this second question, thinking about whether people become more socially connected over time, you can imagine for a second that this person in orange over here, over the course of the quarter, as people get to know them and know that they're highly empathic, they slowly might become more connected over time. So as I mentioned, we're going to actually measure the social network. I forgot to mention that it'll actually be at 3 times. So we can look at the evolution of the social network across the entire quarter, but we're also going to have daily diary interactions for those 2 weeks. So in a smaller time scale, we can look at how who they're interacting with and what they're telling those people. And lastly, thinking about buffering others from stress during that finals period. You might imagine, this is an exaggerated example, but imagine for a second it's finals week. All of these people might seek out these highly empathic people as a source of support. So we're really interested in how interactions and the structure changes during these acute stressors. And we'll also be able to measure the stress levels of people and whether this one person can help buffer people from stress. So in thinking about everything I've told you today, I think I've shown some evidence that positive empathy is a distinct construct at a lot of these different levels, and it's different from negative empathy. In addition, it often predicts things better than prosocial behavior, things like loneliness and social connection, and as well as our overall well-being. So in conclusion, I just want to thank all the research labs and my funding sources for all the help doing this research. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Yes.
Very impressive. I also like that there is a sense of ecological validity to a lot of things that you do.
Yeah.
I was wondering on the negative empathy side,
Yeah.
whether the negative empathy, as you measure it, mixes together with genuine empathy, kind of empathy, empathic distress, it's an Heisenberg talked about,
Yeah.
which is they identify not true empathy, but one's own distress, seeing others.
Yeah.
About that and whether that might be, you might be able to differentiate those things.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
another thing is obviously you are interested in individual differences, and I think that that is really very interesting. So, for example, some people may respond to others' positive emotions with what I have called at some point comparison distress.
Yes. Yes.
These people are having
Yeah.
these positive things, but I am objecting them. So to look at individual orientations that have to do with that. And also it would be really try to establish some causal relationship.
Yeah.
You know, what's the relationship between positive connections to other people and positive empathy?
Right, right. So to answer your first, were you guys able to hear that question in the back? Okay. Yeah. For the first question, so the measures that I used for what I'm calling negative empathy are classically called empathic concern. So that's supposed to reflect that even when someone's feeling negative, I'm concerned and I'm focused on them. And you mentioned the other concept with personal distress. So I'm also, all of my studies have measured personal distress in addition. And I think it's an important distinction. And above and beyond personal distress, positive empathy is also predicting it. But what's interesting is positive or personal distress is that usually a negative predictor. So the more distressed I feel, the more lonely I am, the more stressed I am. So it's interesting. It felt like positive empathy was boosting things and personal distress was decreasing things. So it seemed like a more powerful predictor than negative empathy, but in the opposite direction. But I have tried to also distinguish between those, but one thing in the social network study is we measured both negative empathy or empathic concern and personal distress, and we're interested in how that might affect stress levels. So you could imagine someone who's more likely to experience personal distress instead of empathy and connecting with someone's negative emotion might do worse when they have to hear about a lot of people's negative events. So yeah, and then the second piece that you mentioned, I think that's really interesting, like thinking about the boundaries of when we experience positive empathy versus we feel jealous or we compare ourselves. So that's a cool direction that I'd like to go into, thinking about when you're more likely, for example, are people low in self-esteem, more threatened by other people's positive events, so it might actually inhibit their positive empathy. I saw a recent study looking at successes in married couples, so men are really threatened by the wife's successes, but not the reverse way. So it suggests that there might be some variability in terms of how people respond to other positive events. That could be explored, and it would be interesting to see how those relate to positive empathy. So, yeah. Thanks.
Talking about the comparison distress.
Yeah.
I was curious if you knew that maybe it has to do with being a tech. For example, if my friend gets a job and I already have a job, I'm treating her as if I'm still unemployed in 6 months.
Yeah.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And most importantly, do you think that it might be a separate emotion and separate process from positive empathy, or do you think that it just indicates a lower level of positive empathy as an individual?
That's a great question. So there's been a little bit of work done by Mina Sakara and some people looking at intergroup differences. So that's what she shows is that people who are in opposing groups or conflicting groups or just an out-group member, you're more likely to experience just low levels of positive empathy. I don't know that she's measured the other piece, the kind of comparison distress, but there is some like old classic work by Tesser showing you're more likely to feel threatened when it's in your domain. So like you're mentioning, or we can all imagine being grad students, when someone gets the fellowship that you didn't, you're much more likely to not experience empathy and feel jealous. So I think that basic premise I would predict would be true. So you're basically going to experience positive empathy probably in close relationships with people that you really like and aren't threatened by. I do think that comparison stress probably less often, but it's definitely a cool